Marriage as an instrument of state. The first and most important rule of royal marriage was that it had almost nothing to do with love. A royal wedding was an instrument of statecraft, a treaty sealed in flesh, arranged to bind two dynasties together, to end a war, to forge an alliance, or to press a claim to a foreign throne. Princes and princesses were the diplomatic currency of their families, married off to secure borders and win advantage, their personal feelings counting for nothing against the interests of the state. The Habsburg dynasty raised this principle to an art form, expanding its empire across Europe more through shrewd marriages than through war, and boasting in a famous motto that others might wage war, but happy Austria should marry. To wed was to conduct foreign policy by other means. Rule of equal birth. A strict rule in many royal houses, especially in the German-speaking lands, held that a royal could only truly marry a partner of equal birth, a member of another sovereign or royal family. This principle of equal rank meant that the great dynasties kept careful lists of which houses were considered worthy, and a marriage to anyone outside that charmed circle, however noble, was regarded as a marriage beneath oneself. The purpose was to keep royal blood pure and to protect the prestige and the inheritance of the dynasty from dilution. A prince who fell in love with a mere countess, or even a minor aristocrat, might find that his family refused to recognize the union as a proper royal marriage at all, with grave consequences for his wife and his children. Morganatic Marriage. When a royal insisted on marrying someone of lower rank, the solution was often the morganatic marriage, a legal but unequal union in which the humbler spouse and any children were formally barred from inheriting the royal titles, the rank, and the throne. Sometimes called a left-handed marriage, it allowed a prince to wed the woman he loved while protecting the bloodline of the dynasty from her lesser status. The most tragic example involved the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the empire, who married a mere countess in a morganatic union. His wife was forbidden to share his rank, could not sit beside him on state occasions, and their children were excluded from the succession. It was while riding together in Sarajevo in 1914 that the couple was assassinated, lighting the fuse of the First World War. Marrying within the faith. Religion drew some of the hardest lines around royal marriage, for a crown was often bound inseparably to a particular faith, and to marry outside it could cost a royal the throne itself. In Britain, a law passed in 1701 declared that anyone who married a Roman Catholic was forever barred from the succession, a rule aimed at keeping the crown firmly Protestant after a century of religious strife. For over 300 years, this excluded royals who fell in love with Catholics from their place in line. Only in 2013 was the ban on marrying a Catholic finally lifted, although the monarch must still be in communion with the Protestant Church of England. Across history, the demand to marry within the faith shaped and constrained the choices of royalty as powerfully as any question of rank. Sovereign's consent. In many monarchies, a royal could not simply choose to marry, for the law required the permission of the reigning sovereign before any member of the family could wed. In Britain, a famous act was passed in 1772. After two of the king's own brothers made marriages he considered disastrous, declaring that the descendants of the royal line must obtain the monarch's consent to marry, and that any marriage made without it was void. The rule gave the head of the family enormous power over the romantic lives of their relatives, allowing a king to block a match he disliked, and to control the shape of the dynasty for generations. A modern version survives to this day, requiring those closest to the throne to seek the sovereign's blessing before they marry. Betrothal in the Cradle. Because royal marriages were matters of high politics, they were often arranged when the future bride and groom were still small children, and sometimes when they were babies still in the cradle. A betrothal could be agreed between two royal houses to seal an alliance years or even decades before the wedding could take place, binding two infants to a future union neither could understand or consent to. Royal children thus grew up knowing they were already promised to a distant prince or princess they had never met. A pawn moved into place on the diplomatic board. Such early betrothals were frequently broken when the political winds changed, and a child engaged 1 year to the heir of one kingdom might find themselves promised the next year to a rival, all according to the shifting needs of state. Marriage of cousins. To keep power, wealth, and royal blood concentrated within the family, royalty married their own relatives with a frequency that would be unthinkable in ordinary society. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and the same handful of dynasties intermarried across the generations until the royal houses of Europe became a single vast and tangled family tree. The Christian Church forbade marriage within certain close degrees of blood relationship, but royalty could simply apply to the Pope for a special dispensation to set the rule aside, and such permissions were granted readily to those with power and money. This relentless intermarriage tied the ruling houses together in a web of kinship so dense that by the modern age, the monarchs of Europe were very often first or second cousins to one another. Portrait and the Envoy. When a royal was to marry a foreign partner they had never met, and might not meet until the wedding itself, the match was judged from a distance through painted portraits and the reports of trusted ambassadors sent to inspect the prospective spouse. A flattering portrait could make or break an alliance, and the risk of deception was real. The most famous disaster befell King Henry VIII of England, who agreed to marry the German princess Anne of Cleves after admiring a handsome portrait painted by the master Hans Holbein. When the king finally met his bride in person, he was bitterly disappointed, feeling the painting had misled him, and the marriage was hastily annulled within months. The episode became a lasting warning about the gap between the flattering image and the living reality. Marriage by proxy. Since royal brides and grooms were so often separated by hundreds of miles at the time of their wedding, royalty developed the remarkable custom of marriage by proxy, in which the absent partner was represented at the ceremony by a stand-in. A nobleman or noblewoman would take the place of the distant prince or princess, speaking the vows on their behalf, so that the couple could be legally married before they had ever laid eyes on one another. In some cases, the ritual went further, with the proxy symbolically touching the bride to represent the union. The Emperor Napoleon married his second wife, an Austrian archduchess, by proxy in Vienna, before she ever traveled to France to meet him. Only after the proxy wedding would the real bride set out on the long journey to join her unseen husband. The dowry. No royal marriage was complete without the negotiation of the dowry, the payment in money, goods, or land that the bride brought with her to the union, often the subject of harder bargaining than any romantic consideration. For a great match, the dowry could be a fortune, or even whole territories that changed hands as part of the marriage contract, so that a wedding could reshape the map. When the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England, her enormous dowry included the distant trading ports of Tangier and Bombay, handing England a foothold in India that would grow into an empire. The dowry made a royal bride a valuable prize, and the failure to pay one in full could poison relations between two royal families for years to come. Duty to consummate. A royal marriage was not considered fully valid and binding until it had been consummated, and so the wedding night carried an importance far beyond the private. In earlier ages, the newlyweds were sometimes ceremonially put to bed together before witnesses, and the consummation of a royal union could be a matter of public and diplomatic record, since the whole alliance rested upon it. Crucially, a marriage that was never consummated could be annulled, declared never to have been a true marriage at all, which made non-consummation a convenient escape route for a royal who wished to be rid of an unwanted spouse. King Henry VIII used exactly this argument to free himself from his marriage to Anne of Cleves, swearing the union had never been completed and having it dissolved. Duty to produce an heir. Above every other purpose, a royal marriage existed to produce an heir, a legitimate child, and above all a son, to carry the dynasty into the next generation. This was the ultimate measure of a marriage's success, and a queen who failed to bear a surviving male heir could find her position, and even her life, in mortal danger. The entire turbulent marital history of King Henry VIII, who cast aside or executed one wife after another and broke with the Catholic Church itself, was driven by his desperate need for a son. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, was discarded after failing to give him a male heir who lived. In a royal marriage, the bearing of children was not a private joy but the very reason for the union's existence. Ban on marrying a divorcée. For centuries it was scandalous and often forbidden for a royal to marry a person who had been divorced and whose former spouse still lived, a rule rooted in the teachings of the Church. This ancient prohibition produced the most dramatic royal crisis of the 20th century. In 1936, the new British King Edward VIII wished to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced twice and whose former husbands were still living. As the head of the Church of England, which did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons, the king faced the impossible choice between his crown and the woman he loved. He chose love, abdicating the throne after less than a year to marry her, in a decision that stunned the world and changed the course of the monarchy. Renouncing the throne to marry. When a royal insisted on marrying against the rules, the price was often the throne itself, or their place in the line of succession, which they were required to renounce in order to be free to wed. To marry a commoner, a divorcée, or a person of the wrong faith could mean signing away one's royal status and stepping out of the succession forever. In the Imperial House of Japan, the rule remains especially severe for women, for a princess who marries a commoner must leave the imperial family altogether, surrendering her title and her royal life to become an ordinary citizen. Again and again through history, royals have been forced to weigh their hearts against their crowns, and those who chose love frequently paid for it by giving up the very birthright that made them royal. Polygamy. Not every royal tradition demanded a single spouse, and in a number of monarchies the ruler was permitted, and even expected, to take more than one wife. In the Islamic world, a king could marry up to 4 wives under religious law, and many dynasties across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa practiced royal polygamy as a matter of course. The custom served the dynastic purpose of producing many potential heirs, and of binding numerous families to the crown through marriage. In the African kingdom of Eswatini, the ruling monarch still takes many wives, choosing new ones in the course of great national ceremonies, and each queen brings her own family into alliance with the king. Where it was practiced, plural marriage multiplied the ruler's alliances and his offspring alike, strengthening the dynasty through sheer numbers. Imperial Harem. In the greatest of the Islamic empires, royal marriage and reproduction were organized through the institution of the harem, the vast and secluded household of the ruler's wives, concubines, and female relatives. The Ottoman imperial harem was a world unto itself, home to hundreds of women, guarded by eunuchs and governed internally by the sultan's own mother, who held the powerful title of Valid Sultan and often ruled the harem as a center of political intrigue. A concubine who bore the sultan a son could rise to extraordinary heights, and one famous woman rose from slavery to become the legal wife of the mighty Suleiman the Magnificent, and one of the most powerful figures in the empire. Far from being merely a place of pleasure, the harem was an engine of dynastic power and a theater of high politics. Curse of the Bloodline. The obsession with keeping royal blood pure by marrying within the family carried a hidden and terrible price, for generations of intermarriage between close relatives concentrated not only power but also genetic disease. No dynasty suffered this fate more visibly than the Habsburgs, who married cousin to cousin and uncle to niece so relentlessly, across so many generations, that the physical signs became unmistakable, including the pronounced jutting jaw that came to bear their name. The disastrous experiment reached its end in King Charles II of Spain, so afflicted in body and mind by his inbred inheritance that he could barely function and left no children at all. With his death in 1700, the once mighty Spanish line of the Habsburgs became extinct, brought down by the very rule meant to preserve it. Marrying for love. The final rule of royal marriage is that in the modern age, nearly all the old rules have collapsed. The great principles that governed royal unions for 1,000 years, that marriage was a treaty, that a partner must be of equal royal birth, that love was irrelevant, have quietly fallen away one by one. Today, the monarchies of Europe not only permit but celebrate marriages to commoners, and the crown princes and princesses of Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Spain, Britain, and beyond have married ordinary citizens they met at university, at work, or through sport. The future kings and queens of Europe now choose their own partners for love, and their weddings are presented to the world as fairy tale romances. In a single lifetime, the royal marriage has been transformed from an instrument of state into a love match, completing the most profound revolution in the entire history of royalty. Thanks for watching. Which royal marriage rule shocked you the most, and which one are you glad is gone? Let me know down below. Also, please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.